Hello and welcome to my channel, Rhino here. Today I'm looking at a video from a smaller channel called Campaign for Christ International. In this video, he claims to give us proof that Christianity is true, which I'm sure will be entirely convincing. So let's take a look at what he's got.
Hello friends.
Hello, Discount Matt Smith.
Today I want to give you proof that Christianity is true. Proof that Jesus Christ is the Son of God.
Yep, that's what I'm here for.
To begin with, let me tell you a short story. I know this guy who has a white-collar job, and he went to work one day with a piece of paper.
As one tends to do when one works a white-collar job.
And on that piece of paper was one paragraph. He showed his coworkers this paper, and his coworkers were of different religions, different worldviews, some were even atheists, and he asked them all what this paragraph was talking about. Here's what it said.
I'm going to skip this bit for you because it's just Isaiah 53, 5-9. That's the "he was pierced for our transgressions" thing. We all know it.
He showed them these words, and then he asked them, who is this talking about? Every single one of his coworkers, people from different parts of the world, different religions, different worldviews, all had the same answer. They said, well, obviously it's talking about Jesus Christ.
Yeah, if you're existing in a culture that is mostly Christian, as anyone operating in North America would be most likely, then no matter what your actual religious background, you're already primed to think of that passage as being very Jesus-y. And those are verses that are most often quoted at the pulpit as being about Jesus, so sure, of course people are going to immediately think Jesus when you present them with verses that have been culturally tied to Jesus like these ones have been. But I wonder if the results would have been the same had we performed the same experiment, but with different parts of that same chapter. Try this paragraph on for size. For he grew up before him like a young plant, and like a root out of dry ground. He had no form or majesty that we should look at him, and no beauty that we should desire him. He was despised and rejected by men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief, and as one from whom men hide their faces. He was despised, and we esteemed him not. Yet it was the will of the Lord to crush him. He put him to grief. When his soul makes an offering for guilt, he shall see his offspring. He shall prolong his days. The will of the Lord shall prosper in his hand. Now, do you think you'd have the same result with that one? My guess would be no. There are a few key phrases here that make this part of the prophecy very much not about Jesus. For starters, it basically opens with, "Damn, what an ugly dude that everyone hates." The Bible doesn't really give a physical description of Jesus, so maybe he was ugly, but that still doesn't really fit well with the several stories of the thousands of followers that Jesus amassed during his ministry. And then it goes on to talk about him seeing his offspring. Now, again, the Bible doesn't explicitly state that Jesus did not have kids, but I feel like the theological implications there are too much for most Christians to bear, so they'd rather think of him as never having reproduced. Now, if we look at some non-Christian scholarship on the subject, we see that the most likely candidate for the subject of these verses is the nation of Israel itself. It's referred to by name several times throughout Isaiah, and Israel is often referred to as God's servant. But if we really have to have an individual person that these verses are about, Hezekiah fits just as well as Jesus does. You may remember Hezekiah as being the guy who was sick, who God told to get his affairs in order because he's about to die. After a prayer, God changed his mind and gave Hezekiah 15 more years of life. Hezekiah was a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief, being sick to the point of death. He was oppressed and afflicted, but then the Lord granted him 15 extra years of life, in which he had a child, and so his days were prolonged so that he could see his offspring. It's not a great fit with the whole piercing and his grave being with the wicked and a rich man in his death, but he fits just about as well as Jesus does, all things considered. I still think it's about Israel as a nation, though. That fits better with the style of the book. After all, we have several verses throughout Isaiah that explicitly make the connection between Israel and God's servant, like chapter 44, verse 1, "But now hear, O Jacob, my servant Israel, whom I have chosen." Chapter 45, verse 4, "For the sake of my servant Jacob and Israel, my chosen, I call you by your name. I name you, though you do not know me." And chapter 49, verse 3, "And he said to me, You are my servant Israel, in whom I will be glorified." Now, keep in mind, Israel is the name that God gave to Jacob after he wrestled with him, so Israel and Jacob are used almost interchangeably. And as a side note, I would be remiss if I spoke of the passage where Jacob wrestles with God if I didn't also point out that, in the story, Jacob almost beat God, but God figured that he couldn't win, and then in a desperate move, he hit Jacob's hip socket. Except that the words translated as hip socket there are somewhat ambiguous, and it has been suggested by some scholars that this was a euphemism for Jacob's, ladder. His dick. God punched Jacob in the dick to win the fight. It's not conclusive by any stretch of the imagination, but it is possible. And if it's possible to take a dick joke interpretation of a verse, then by God, I'll take the dick joke interpretation of that verse.
But these words were written 700 years before Jesus was born. They're found in the book of Isaiah, the 53rd chapter.
Yeah, it was written about 700 years earlier than the dude lived. And then the guys who wrote down this story several decades after he died managed to make a few of the details of Jesus' story match up with a few of the details of this Isaiah writing, but didn't manage to make it fit the whole thing. Maybe it was just well known that Jesus was a childless bachelor, so they couldn't get away with squeezing his offspring into the story? Who knows? The point is, Jesus only half fits the prophecy, and there are a lot of unknowns when it comes to the story of Jesus' life, so it is entirely plausible that the authors of the Gospels were adding in details specifically to make Jesus look like he fit some of the well-known messianic prophecies. It didn't even need to be the authors themselves. This sort of thing could easily have happened organically from a ground-up evolution of the story as it is told and retold. The more people telling the story, the more people there are to notice a potential connection with the prophecies, the more the story nudges in that general direction of matching better with those prophecies. We have good evidence that early Christianity, the kind that existed before the Gospels were written, was even more diverse in beliefs and opinions than modern Christianity is today. The idea that some of the stories being told in such a time could have been adjusted to better fit with the prophecies in retrospect, purposefully or not, it is not only mundane, it is expected.
All throughout the Old Testament, there are prophecies that Jesus fulfilled. Actually, according to Oxford scholar Alfred Eldersheim, there are over 400 prophecies that Jesus fulfilled.
Usually the number given is 300. Well, I guess they do usually say that it's over 300, and over 400 is also over 300, so sure, why not? But really, the number doesn't matter, given the whole stories written after his death could easily have been altered to appear to fulfill prophecy, especially since we have clear examples of contradictory stories that are supposed to be fulfilling slightly different sets of prophecies. The birth stories come immediately to mind. Those are the ones where it appears as though the authors were both under the impression that the Messiah was supposed to come from the city of David, Bethlehem, but that Jesus guy was known to have been from Nazareth. And so it had to be explained how this guy that was known to be from Nazareth could have been from the city of David. Luke had them living in Nazareth, but traveling to Bethlehem for a census, and then after a pretty normal childbirth, okay, it had a bunch of smelly shepherds popping in to say hi to the baby, so not exactly normal, but compared to the other story, everything goes pretty much as it should. Baby's born, baby's circumcised, presented at the temple, and then after a few months at most, they return to Nazareth. And so Jesus of Nazareth is actually from the city of David. But Matthew wanted to tick a few extra prophecy boxes off while he's at it, so he starts with Joseph and Mary already living in Bethlehem, and after living in Bethlehem for a couple years with Jesus as a baby, some wise guys show up to pay homage to the new king, which King Herod didn't like too much, seeing as how he's, already the king, and kings generally don't like other kings being around. So he has all the toddler boys of the city killed in a story that closely parallels the Moses story, with Joseph and Mary fleeing to Egypt to avoid the killing. Then, after Herod dies, they come back to Judea, but are scared of Herod's son, so go to Nazareth instead of Bethlehem. So for Matthew, we get the same reconciliation of Jesus being from Nazareth and Bethlehem as we do in Luke, but he threw Egypt into the mix to cover the out of Egypt I call my son bit.
And I'll list some of those prophecies in the description below so you can take a look at those.
Yeah, there certainly is a list there, and there's a few on that list that I haven't covered before. Now, in a video back in December, I went through a few of the prophecies that are usually put on the lists of over 300 or 400 fulfilled prophecies, and they were disappointing to say the least. But let's give it another go. I'm going to jump straight onto that Psalm 91 prophecy because memorizing Psalm 91 was part of my grade 8 Christian lifestyle class curriculum, and I've used the quadratic equation more often than I've used that. So let's dust off that part of my brain and see if it's still functional. I don't recall there being anything about a prophecy in it, so let's see. Psalm 91 verses 10 through 12 are supposed to predict that the Messiah will be tempted by Satan, so let's look at it. No evil shall be allowed to befall you, no plague come near your tent. For he will command his angels concerning you to guard you in all your ways. On their hands they will bear you up, lest you strike your foot against a stone. Okay, that is what Satan is supposed to have said to Jesus while he was tempting him, but that is by no means a prophecy. Nowhere here does it say anything to indicate that the psalm is talking about the Son of God being tempted by the devil. Quite the contrary, this psalm is traditionally used by normal, non-God humans to ward off evil spirits, often being found written on amulets. So it's not predicting a future encounter with an evil spirit, it's meant to prevent encounters with evil spirits. But let's entertain it for a little. Hypothetically, let's say I got into a car accident that killed my whole family except for me. Upon realizing their grim fate, I say, "That it will never come again is what makes life so sweet." This is a quote from Emily Dickinson. In this hypothetical scenario, has Emily Dickinson prophesied the death of my family? Absolutely not. I just use my knowledge of an already extant work of literature in an apropos situation. And, of course, all of this is assuming that we take Matthew and Luke at face value and assume that the event actually happened as they described. But if it did, who was there to witness it? Whose accounts are we reading? There is no mention of Jesus telling the story as a lesson at any point. Nobody was there to witness it except for Jesus and Satan, and Jesus certainly didn't do any of the writing, so how do we even know that this happened to begin with?
Mathematicians tell us that the chances of someone fulfilling 8 of these prophecies is 1 to the whatever number appears on your screen. I don't know if that number is too big for me to, there's a lot of zeros.
That's what scientific notation is for. That number is 10 to the power of 17.
But that's the chances of someone fulfilling just 8 of the prophecies that Jesus fulfilled.
Yeah, I was trying to figure out how these calculations were performed because there are just so many variables that need to be accounted for. I'm curious if the calculations took into account the fact that different events have different probabilities and will have different probabilities for different people in different times and places. For instance, the Jews were looking for a Jewish Messiah, so that kind of restricts us to looking at Jewish people. Well, one of the so-called prophecies that we've seen so far is that someone quoted a book of Jewish scripture at Jesus. So, if we're looking for a Jew, what are the odds that someone at some point in time would quote a psalm at him? Particularly a psalm that is one of the more quotable psalms. Psalm 91:12 is going to fit into a much broader range of events than Psalm 137:9 after all. That's the one where "Blessed is he who takes your little ones and dashes them on the rocks." Anywho, in trying to figure out who performed the original calculations, I found many unsourced articles presenting themselves as original material which kept using the number 8. That was always the first example, 8 prophecies, and always with the same result. Well, eventually I did find it. Some people were misattributing it to Lee Strobel, who seems to have mainly just added to the math with his analogy of the whole world being covered in white tile with one tile painted red on the underside, and the odds being equivalent to randomly selecting the one red tile from the whole lot. Others cited Josh McDowell, who repeated this calculation in his 1972 book, Evidence That Demands a Verdict. But McDowell is definitely not a mathematician. But when tracing this claim to its origin, I found that it did actually originate with someone who knows math, Dr. Peter Stoner, the mathematician. Unfortunately, the prophecies that he used to make this calculation are often vague, sometimes wrong, are incredibly subjective as to what criteria could be used in order to consider them fulfilled, and as a nice little cherry on top, they were claimed to have been fulfilled in books that were written after the fact and show every sign of having their stories altered specifically to fulfill the prophecies. Often the authors went out of their way to write down that such and such was done to fulfill the prophecies. So the guys writing the story wanted the story to have fulfilled prophecy and had prior knowledge of the prophecies. And you want me to believe that the stories were perfectly faithful retellings of the actual events? But let's give them a quick look-see, just to see what 8 he thought were the best of the best, worth featuring in his prophetic calculations. First off, he looks at Micah 5:2. That's the one that is talking about Bethlehem Ephratah, a clan of Judah, not the city of Bethlehem, which is then used to say that Jesus had to be born in Bethlehem. It's not saying that, and even if it were, we have two mutually exclusive birth narratives to place him in Bethlehem, so that's not exactly reliable, but everybody else agrees that Jesus was from Nazareth, even the book of Acts, which predates all the Gospels. So if we're looking for multiple independent sources attesting his birth in Bethlehem, then we don't get it. But we do have multiple independent sources attesting to his being from Nazareth, so it's debatable whether or not this non-prophecy would even count as fulfilled. Next is Malachi 3:1, which all agree is a prophecy. It's saying that God is going to send someone to prepare the way, but what does that even mean? How does one prepare a way? I know Jesus had John the Baptist for that, but this is so vague as to be useless. Really, there are actually several characters in the Jesus story that could fit the bill. The angel prepared the way by telling Mary about her coming pregnancy and by telling Joseph so he didn't divorce Mary. Quirinius prepared the way by instituting a completely unprecedented census that forced Joseph and Mary to Bethlehem. The Magi prepared the way by alerting Herod to the existence of Jesus, setting into motion the events that led to Joseph and Mary fleeing to Egypt so that Jesus could fulfill the "out of Egypt I called my son" prophecy. And I could go on. So we have no real way of learning whether or not this prophecy was actually fulfilled, except for the assertions of the Gospels. Now, I could go on, but the rest have similar problems of either not being prophetic in the first place, not being specific, being easy for a later author to insert into the story, or some combination of the three. In one case, they treat two verses right next to each other as two independent prophecies, Zechariah 11:12 and 11:13, which serves to pad the numbers a bit, making it look more impressive than it otherwise would be, even if we grant that it is a fulfilled prophecy. Ultimately, there are so many problems with this calculation that it remains entirely unconvincing. I didn't even get into the fact that only one of the 8 probability estimates has any data backing it up. The rest of them are completely arbitrary guesses by students in Dr. Stoner's class. And then, even if it were completely accurate, low probability events happen all the time. Similar styled characteristics could easily be used to come up with a much lower probability for your own existence. What are the odds that your exact parents would meet each other? What are the odds that they would get along well enough to at some point have a sexual relationship? What are the odds that of the particular union that brought you about, the right sperm and egg just so happen to be the two out of the millions to billions of potential sperm-egg combinations from your parents to make you? And with that sperm-egg combination, the DNA had to undergo recombination in just the right way to make you. The odds then get mind-bogglingly small if we take these calculations backward through the generations. Now, sure, to predict your existence in advance several hundred years before your existence would be a very impressive achievement to say the least, but what's being done here is akin to someone 30 years after you die, including your name on a family tree, and then people marveling that in order to have fit on that family tree, several highly improbable events must have happened, therefore the family tree fulfills prophecy. The fact that no such prophecy existed apparently isn't a problem, as a great many of the hundreds of fulfilled prophecies weren't even prophetic writings in the first place.
One person fulfilling 48 of the prophecies is one chance in 10 to the 157th power.
Oh, so you do know scientific notation. Okay.
One person fulfilling 400? That's just impossible.
Just as impossible as your existence. Probably less impossible than your existence now that I think about it.
Now, those aren't my numbers. Mathematicians have come up with that, and I'll put the citation, the link where I got those numbers from, in the description.
Lest you think I went hunting for sources for those numbers without reason, since he gave his source in the description, his source was probably the worst article on the subject that I came across. It's an article on the Christian Broadcasting Network website that is written anonymously and cites the number with a vague "mathematicians put it this way" before going into those numbers that I got to know oh so well on my hunt for the actual source. No sources for that are found in the article. Notably, both this guy and the article he cited pluralize the word mathematicians, as though there is some mathematical consensus on the matter. To the best of my knowledge, Dr. Stoner is the only mathematician to have performed such calculations, and so more accurately, that would be one mathematician put it this way back in 1958, and sometimes non-mathematicians were impressed enough by it to include it in their books.
My wife and I were reading the Bible just this morning, and we were reading the story of Abraham and his willingness to offer Isaac on the altar. God had told him to sacrifice his son, and so Abraham took his son up to a mountain and laid him down on an altar and took out a knife and raised that knife up, and right before he killed Isaac, God stopped him.
Yup. Great story showing God's love. He tormented Abraham by requiring that of him in the first place, and tormented Isaac by waiting until he was tied up and just about to be killed before stepping in and intervening. All as a test for God to learn something about Abraham that he should already know if he is indeed all-knowing.
God was testing Abraham, but he was also showing the father of the faith what it was going to be like for the Father in heaven to sacrifice his only begotten Son on that same mountain 2,000 years later in the person of Jesus Christ.
Firstly, no, absolutely not. It is not the same at all. If the Bible is true, then God sacrificed his only son for a part of a weekend out of an eternity of existence. That is literally nothing. Second, you don't need to force someone to attempt to kill their child in order to get that point across. Especially if you're an all-powerful God, you could just magically place that information inside Abraham's head when you want him to understand. Third, there's actually no indication in the Bible that this was why God did that to Abraham. This is all speculation and assumption. Fourth, Abraham's unquestioning obedience has been used by some to point to the idea that human sacrifice was a semi-regular occurrence in the ancient Hebrew religion. When God was going to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah, Abraham knew that his nephew Lot was in Sodom, and so he begged God to spare the city if enough righteous people could be found there. But no such bargaining happened for the story of Isaac. Oh, God wants me to sacrifice my child? Sure thing, that's normal, I'll get right to it. There are many problems with the story, and I have yet to see an interpretation of the story that has God coming away looking like the good guy.
On that same mountain, Jesus Christ took the punishment that you and I deserve, the punishment of sin.
Yeah, on that same mountain. That's what some people believe. There's really no evidence for it. It's mostly just an assumption. The Bible certainly doesn't connect those dots. This is 100% the work of later apologists.
And was sacrificed so that we wouldn't have to go to the prison of hell.
Alternatively, he could have just not made the prison of hell. There are definite instances in the Old Testament where God forgives sins without there being a sacrifice first, so this sets the precedent of not needing a sacrifice to gain forgiveness. So hell is completely unnecessary if God actually wants to save us from hell.
The Old Testament prophecies prove Christianity to be true and prove that Jesus was the Son of God.
No, the Old Testament prophecies prove that apologists are grasping at straws. I would encourage anyone who doubts me to actually go through and read the alleged prophecies for themselves. Let me know if you find anything good. I haven't read all of them, but I've read enough to be very unconvinced. Apologists are fond of a select few of the prophecies, like the suffering servant in Isaiah, and that's likely because those are the ones that are the easiest to make fit with the Bible stories of Jesus. But ask yourself this. If there are over 400 prophecies that only Jesus could have fulfilled, why do apologists always go to the same 5 or 6 of them? There's so many to choose from. Why limit yourself to the ones that have been covered a million times over? Go for the more obscure ones that apologists don't talk about, like Joel 2:32, which supposedly predicted that God would offer salvation to all mankind. I know for that one you have to ignore the verses leading up to it that talk about there being wonders in the heavens and on earth before the day the Lord comes, with blood and fire and columns of smoke and the moon turning to blood and the sun darkened. And you have to ignore the second half of the verse that talks about the fact that only a few people who called on the name of the Lord were saved, and it refers to them as survivors, so obviously they survived some earthly catastrophe rather than them being saved and allowed into heaven, but at least that would be new. Or is it that apologists only go for the same 5 or 6 of them because they know how weak the rest of them really are?
Now, there were a lot more. We can see proofs in the resurrection, we can see proofs in the New Testament church, but none shows more evidence than these books written thousands of years before Jesus was ever born.
So you're admitting here that these vague prophecies with questionable fulfillment status are the best evidence you've got? Okay then. That's it for this one. Today's comment of the day comes to us from Nod, who says, "This week in Canada, we are mourning the 215 child graves just found at another Catholic residential school." Yeah, this is one of the atrocities of the Catholic Church that they have refused to even acknowledge thus far. If you're not familiar, the Canadian residential schools are probably the darkest part of Canadian history, and the last one didn't close down until 1996, so this is relatively recent stuff. It was a massive attempt at cultural genocide where Native American kids were forced away from their families, made to live in these schools, most of which were run by the Catholic Church, where they were abused, not allowed to learn about or practice their cultures, given English names, and oftentimes were just completely neglected. And just over the last little while, we found a mass grave of 215 children who died in one of these schools. And I guess I'll leave it on that cheerful note. Thanks for watching. Special thanks as always to my patrons, Mark McManus, Mark Hetchen, What Jesus, and all the rest, who are the students whose unsubstantiated guesses make up the backbone of my channel. If you'd like to conclusively prove that Jesus had to be the Son of God, you can join us on Patreon for as little as $1 per week over at patreon.com/ViceRhino. If you feel so inclined, you can also support the channel through direct donation or my Amazon wishlist, which are linked in the description. If you'd like to listen to my videos in podcast form, the link for that is also in the description, as well as links to my social media accounts and my P.O. Box address. See you next time!